Now, if you have three different agents, do you have three different kinds of consciousness? First of all, for both the thinker and the doer, you need to add the experiencer agent to the thinker to get a conscious being, because you need to have a world model, and that comes from the experiencer. I call this the language consciousness, or LC, because most of our concepts are based in language. So the thinker agent gives you a language consciousness. The doer agent gives you what I'm calling a primary consciousness, and I call it primary consciousness because we share this consciousness with animals. So animals and humans share the primary consciousness. And the experiencer agent gives rise to what I call the fundamental consciousness. Now, I believe that only humans get into this fundamental consciousness state, and the reason we get into it is that we realize that it's not very satisfactory to live as a thinker. And so that's why we get into it, and I'll get into that later. Now I'm going to quickly go through some diagrams that show you those three different kinds of consciousness. This is the language consciousness in modern humans. This is the primary consciousness in modern humans and also in animals. And then this is the fundamental consciousness in modern humans. Here's a table that gives you a comparison between the primary and language consciousness. And I'll just point out a couple of things. The primary consciousness is massively parallel and high bandwidth, whereas the language consciousness is largely serial processing and low bandwidth. And I'll also point out that the primary consciousness does most of the work of living, whereas the language consciousness takes most of the credit. He thinks he did it all, but it's actually the primary consciousness that did it. Now, the fundamental consciousness is very similar to the primary consciousness. One little difference here is that I claim that intuition comes from the fundamental consciousness, because intuition is knowing how the world works without thinking, understanding the world without thinking, whereas instinct is doing something in the world without thinking. And instinct is what the doer does, intuition is what the fundamental consciousness and the experiencer does. And finally, the fundamental consciousness does understand language, which is the same as what the language consciousness does. So I'm now going to show you that the fundamental consciousness is an enlightened state of consciousness. In the Hindu Advaita Vedanta tradition, they say that enlightenment is non-dual. And non-dual means that there's not two one. And it's seen that the self and other distinction is an illusion. In other words, you could say that the world and I are one. And the first experiencer self model is that the self model equals the whole world model. So you can see that fundamental consciousness is non-dual in this sense. In Buddhism, anatta is the realization of no self, that the experience of self of any kind is an illusion. And the second experiencer self model is that there is no self model for the experiencer. So anatta is realized in the fundamental consciousness state. So this is a demonstration that the fundamental consciousness state is what these Eastern religions call enlightened consciousness. Now, comparing this to other ideas, I'm going to do this very quickly. The philosopher Ned Block talks about phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. That's exactly the fundamental consciousness, or the language consciousness, or the primary consciousness. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio proposes a core and extended consciousness. The core is the fundamental consciousness, or primary consciousness. Extended plans into the future and reflects on the past. That's the language consciousness. That's what he does. And finally, there's a bicameral mind consciousness theory of Julian Jaynes, and he claims that the left brain is the language consciousness and the right brain is the primary consciousness. Now, I don't really think that the language consciousness is confined only to the left brain. It's certainly true that the language input and output ports are in the left brain. So it's like a computer that has a keyboard port and a display port. Those ports are in the left brain here for the input and output of language, but I believe the entire brain does language. And then there are a number of experiments in both psychological and neurology that I'm not going to have time to go into this in detail, but there are split brains experiments where they cut the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres to eliminate epilepsy. And what will happen in that case is that the language consciousness, which is now in the left brain because the corpus callosum isn't split, it will confabulate what the right brain is doing. There's a doer in the right brain that's doing actions, and the LC in the left brain will come up with a lie, a confabulation of why he thinks he did it. There's theory of mind that develops at ages 3 and 4, and this is where a toddler starts to develop the theory that other people have a language consciousness model of the world the same that I do, and that's what the theory of mind is. Blind sight phenomenon. Certain kinds of cortical damage can result in blindness in, say, either the right half visual field or the left half visual field. So the person reports, I'm blind there. If you put something in that part of the visual field, they say, I can't see it. However, if you ask them, how many fingers am I holding up? They say, I don't know, I can't see it. Guess. If they guess, they're above chance at guessing the correct number of fingers. So there's some part of their brain is aware of what's in that field, and that's the primary consciousness. It's the language consciousness that's blind. And then there's non-conscious perception or priming. An example of this is that they can flash, say, a picture of a dog or a picture of a cat on a screen very briefly, like 50 milliseconds or less, and then mask it with images before and after. So if you ask the person, did you see any picture there? They say no. But then if you say, name an animal, they're more likely to say the name of the dog or cat, depending on whether the dog or cat was flashed on the screen briefly. So this is a case, again, where the primary consciousness, which has that fast interface, could see that image, but the language consciousness was blind to it. And the primary consciousness then upped the probability that you're going to say dog or cat since you just saw a dog or a cat. Finally, there's Libet's decision delay experiments. These are experiments where the person is told to, whenever they feel like it, press their finger down on a button. And they're given a very fast-moving second hand, and they're asked to recognize where that hand is at the time that they make the decision to press that button. They also put electrodes on the brain, and they find that they can demonstrate that through the electrodes on the brain that the brain was making the decision to press the button about 100 or 200 milliseconds before they were aware that they were making the decision to press the button. Now, it was another couple of 100 milliseconds before the button was pressed. So we are aware of it before we press the button, but there's a delay there. And the reason for that is that the primary consciousness is the one that decided to press the button. And it took a little while for the language consciousness to catch on. Oh, I've decided to press the button. Oh, yes, I pressed the button. And that's the 100 millisecond delay in the Libet delay experiments.